As a little girl, Nadine used to play at being a mother, treating her dolls with a tenderness she herself had never known. Irma and Jordan Taylor's home ran on discipline, respect, and order she had wanted for nothing. Her parents had registered her in the best school in their neighborhood in New York. At Christmas, she was given the toys she had asked for, and even a pair of skates and a bicycle. They let her watch her favorite television show and took her to the cinema on Sundays. Yet she always felt like a guest, someone passing through, the beneficiary of her parents' act of charity. If she woke in the night crying after a nightmare, Irma would get up, switch on the light, and soothe her from a distance. If she was running a fever, Irma would fetch the thermometer and hold cold compresses against her forehead and armpits. She had nothing to complain about. She'd had a happy childhood. She had never been mistreated. She was a good student. She did her homework, and her only chores were keeping her bedroom tidy and taking out the trash. Irma never took the time to teach her to cook, embroider, or knit, as she was convinced Nadine would become a doctor rather than a wife or mother. Perhaps she wanted Nadine to have what she never had, for Irma too was a victim of the war. If it hadn't been for the Nazis, she said she would have gone to work in a hospital, helping those in need. Your mother has such a good heart, Jordan had once told her, after Irma had barked an instruction at Nadine in German. She just wants you to do your best. She was fond of them both, although ever since she was little, she had always been afraid that if she had made a mistake, they would send her back to the convent in Havana. Nadine didn't want to know anything about the past. When she slept, she was frequently besieged by the recurring nightmare of being stranded among the clouds or in the middle of the ocean. Since she was little, she had heard snippets from Irma of the story of her German grandmother, a poet and rebel in a country where being different could cost you your life, of the Jewish family who had rescued her mother, taking her from Berlin to Havana, of her own sudden departure from Cuba, leaving the mother who had sent her away in order to save her. She didn't want to know more. If Nadine didn't acknowledge her past, then it had never happened. She was an orphan. That much she knew. She had been born in Cuba by accident. Her Cuban parents were dead, and the only person she knew of who might still be alive from her childhood was the nun who had organized her departure from Cuba. If she delved farther back into her birth mother's past, the thread soon got lost in an unfathomable war. Nazism had destroyed her family. Then communism had robbed her of the one thing she could call her own. In the end, the Taylors were the only people she could count on. One day, alone, when her parents went to Manhattan, she found a shoebox in her mother's closet containing letters arranged in chronological order, tied together with a yellow ribbon, their envelopes dog-eared with the years. Nadine would have liked to read them, sensing they belonged to her even though she was neither the sender nor the addressee, but it was a long time before she dared to look at them more closely. In the kitchen, while Irma was preparing dinner, Nadine asked her what had happened to her mother. Irma tried to avoid the question. Jordan watched nervously from a distance. Not giving up, Nadine said. I'd like to see where I was born. There's nowhere to go, replied Irma, interrupting her. You can't travel to Cuba. They're still in the middle of a revolution. You need to put all that behind you. Your mother is dead. You're a good American girl now. That evening, Nadine felt her parents were on edge. She thought it was because she brought up wanting to go to Cuba, but what had really shaken them was a phone call from a stranger. The caller then unexpectedly showed up at their house just before they were sitting down to dinner the next night. He said he was a journalist investigating war crimes. Are you Irma Bronze? Said the man, holding a heavy leather briefcase. Without being invited, the journalist walked inside and sat down in the living room. Irma and Jordan looked at each other and remained on their feet, facing the man. Nadine started to tremble, without understanding why. Her mother sighed with resignation and sat down on one of the armchairs. She looked like she had been expecting this moment all her life. You better go up to your room, Jordan told Nadine. Beginning the day after the journalist's visit, Nadine's parents regularly started taking the subway into Manhattan, consulting with lawyers and sending documents that proved they were American citizens and had never committed any crimes. When the Taylors were away on one such trip, Nadine and her best friend, Miranda, took out the shoebox of letters that Irma had hidden in her closet. They were letters between her adopted mother and the nun from the convent who had managed to get Nadine, along with more than 10,000 other children, out of Havana to save them from communist indoctrination via a program that some bureaucrat later ironically dubbed Operation Pedro Pan. Nadine stopped Miranda from emptying the shoebox onto the dining room table. We have to leave it all exactly the same, she said, memorizing the way the letters were tied and set out. Miranda read out odd paragraphs in English that made no sense to either of them, while Nadine rummaged through envelopes and documents she couldn't comprehend. They referred to Nadine's German blood, of the closeness of her parents to the Cuban government that had been overthrown. of fear and persecution. At first, Miranda assumed this referred to the Nazis. For her and her family, any mention of persecution always had to do with the Nazis. But Nadine explained that the nun, Sister Irene, was talking about recent events in Cuba, where she had been born. In a copy of a letter Irma had sent to Sister Irene making the case for the Taylors' suitability as adoptive parents, she made reference to her Catholic faith, her own childhood in Vienna, her dreams of becoming a nurse, the changes brought about by the war. She mentioned the years she spent in Berlin, where she met her husband, an electrician from Cleveland, Ohio, who fought for the Allies. Irma had been working in a hospital in Berlin, she wrote, when she met the American. Shortly after, they got married and she accompanied him to New York. They had lived ever since, she wrote, in a comfortable home with a spare bedroom for the little girl. With the letter, there was a document from the Archdiocese of New York endorsing the Taylor family and remarking on their religious devotion and good nature. Nadine was hoping to discover some secret, but the letter only contained details of a story she already knew in broad strokes. In another letter, the nun said that she had lost contact with Lilith Bernal, Nadine's birth mother, and that what became of her only God could know. Lilith was worn down by so much loss, the nun said. However much you pray, pain still weighs you down. As she went through them all, Nadine found one letter separate from the others and without an envelope, folded in half. The nun's handwriting had passed through to the other side of the paper, and Nadine opened it with utmost care. The paper had aged more than the rest. It was yellowish, tattered, and ink-faded, as if it had survived a shipwreck. Inside was a sepia photograph, printed on a little piece of cardstock with serrated edges. It was a woman with a baby in her arms. Nadine showed it to Miranda, whose eyes grew wide as she lifted a hand to her mouth. They sat and studied the image. "You look just like your mother," Miranda said in amazement. Nadine's name was written on the back of the photograph in handwriting that differed from the others. "That's my real mother's handwriting. Real mother." She had never said it that way before. For Nadine, the only parents who existed in her life were the Taylors. Irma was her only mother. Nadine felt as if she had discovered a treasure that had been hidden for years. Her real mother, Lilith, had tied back her hair, leaving her forehead exposed. The baby was wrapped in a knitted blanket trimmed with lace. Both of them were looking at the camera, as if seeking approval. Burning with curiosity, Miranda snatched the letter from Nadine and began reading aloud in a soft, almost inaudible voice. Nadine followed the writing as she read, scrutinizing each word, each phrase the nun had written in her rudimentary English. It was a kind of summary that the nun had obtained from her mother once the Taylor family had agreed to adopt the little girl. She read her real name, Nadine Bernal Keller. Her birth mother was called Lilith Keller de Bernal, although it had been written as Herzogin, an old German passport. Senora Keller de Bernal had come to Cuba thanks to paperwork prepared by Franz Boller, whom she called her guardian angel, Professor Bruno Bormann, a Jewish family who had adopted her as their own child. Lilith was the daughter of a German writer, Ali Keller, killed by the Nazis in Sachsenhausen concentration camp on the outskirts of Berlin around 1940. According to the nun, although the baby was fair-skinned, her mother, Lilith Keller, was mixed race, and therefore her mother, Nadine's grandmother, had needed to get her out of Berlin to spare her from suffering under the Nazi racial hygiene laws. Lilith was the daughter of a German Catholic woman and a black German man, who in turn was the son of a German woman and an African man. When they finished reading the letters, they fell silent. "And what happened to your mother in the end?" "My mother? Lilith. She is dead." "It must be painful to have to give away your daughter. My grandmother says that there are people who die of pain." Nadine's head lowered. "So you're black?" Miranda couldn't get over it. As Miranda read the last sentence, Nadine stood up. She had heard a car pulling up outside the house and realized her parents were home. "We need to put everything back just as it was," Nadine said, flustered. For months, her father continued to hide the truth about what had happened when the reporter visited them. One day when Nadine got home from school, Irma was no longer there. Jordan sat her down in the dimly lit living room of their house in Queens, and after a long silence, his arms hanging limp and his face haggard, told her something she didn't want to hear. "Your mother has been taken to a German jail. They say she was a Nazi during the war and did some very bad things. We're going to Germany to support her during the trial." She could see even saying this much was painful for him. "Your mother is innocent," he declared with absolute certainty. The next day, Jordan collected Nadine from school to tell her it was best she didn't go to class or see her friend Miranda for a while until things had returned to normal. Nadine wasn't about to give up her best friend. In the end, nothing returned to normal. Her father stopped sleeping, spending all day locked up in his room, making telephone calls and selling the properties they owned, including a share of the small electrical business bought by one of his partners for a pittance. Jordan Taylor's face became furrowed. His hair started to thin. I'm shedding my leaves, he said one evening, trying to lighten the mood during one of their slow, silent dinners. Now that they were alone, it was Jordan who went into Nadine's room at bedtime and asked her how she was, if she wanted a glass of warm milk. He occasionally ran his hand over her head, absent-mindedly, his way of giving her a caress. They were going to leave the country, she knew it, and the house with its lace curtains made by Irma, the only home she had any memory of, would belong to another family. Jordan explained that Nadine would accompany him to Dusseldorf to help her mother, who had found herself locked up in a cell because one day a stranger had knocked on the door and asked to speak with her. Jordan knew that he would never be able to convince Nadine to fly. She had been sent off, alone, on a plane when she was barely 3 years old, first to Miami and then to New York, a city so far away it forced her to give up any hope of ever returning to the place she came from. Over the years, she had told her parents many times that she would never fly again. In her mind, all the anxiety and grief she experienced as a small child became associated with flying in an airplane, and her phobia of flying only intensified as the years went by. One evening, her father told her they were going to cross the Atlantic on a boat. From there, they would take a train to where Irma was being held in Germany. With nostalgia in his voice, he said he could still remember the beer he drank in Berlin after the war. He had never tasted anything like it since, even though most bars in their Queens neighborhood supposedly sold the same brand. It'll be an adventure, Nadine. We'll finally find out what happened to your German grandmother, the writer, he said. You might even help your mother. She needs us, both of us, now more than ever. The thing Nadine most resented about having to leave New York was losing her best friend. She and Miranda had been inseparable since kindergarten. Jordan never said this was a one-way trip, but all the signs were there. They had put the house up for sale and offered all of her mother's jewelry to the pawn shop on Lee Street. One weekend, not long before they left, Nadine noticed her mother's closet was empty, except for bare coat hangers and a box tucked on a high shelf. When she saw the shoebox of letters from Cuba was still in the same place her mother had hidden it, Nadine decided to take the letters and tuck them in her suitcase. Miranda was as stunned by the suddenness of her friend's departure as Nadine. Still, during Nadine's final weeks in New York, they only saw each other in class. Miranda was busy discovering her body with the help of an Italian boy whom she described as a kind of octopus. The two of them used to walk around the neighborhood after school and often ended up at Miranda's house. Nadine didn't like any of the boys at school. She told Miranda that she wouldn't have a boyfriend until she got to college. One day, I'm going to be a doctor, and I'm going to marry a doctor too, Nadine would tell her. That's too many years of studying for me, Miranda replied. I'll end up a teacher, like my mother. What she never told Miranda was that she had plans to go study in Germany. We will go to the same university together. You can be sure of that, Miranda said. And one day we'll live together in Manhattan. Nadine recalled that one of the last family dinners she was invited to at Miranda's house, Miranda had insisted that every German who wasn't Jewish and had survived the war must be a Nazi. Miranda had insisted that every German who wasn't Jewish and had survived the war must be a Nazi. This was something Miranda had heard her grandparents say for as long as she could remember. There were no innocent Germans, she had said. People who didn't look like them were thrown into the ovens, and people who opposed them got a bullet in the head. Nadine told her friend that she believed her mother Irma was born in Vienna and had only taken German citizenship after the war to avoid starvation. Well, there's always an exception to the rule, and, in the end, you are adopted, Miranda answered, shrugging her shoulders. One thing's for sure, you and I wouldn't have survived in Germany. We would have been gassed, and from there to the ovens, you for having a black grandfather, me for being Jewish. The two friends played with makeup and would often compare themselves in front of the mirror, trying to pick out the physical characteristics that most defined them. They traced their profile, then their ears and forehead, finding hardly any differences that set them apart. They were the same height, both had long necks, pale skin, blue eyes that turned green in sunlight, and wavy chestnut brown hair. Spending so much time in front of the mirror had made them experts in applying eyeliner and lipstick and drawing beauty spots on their cheeks. Although Miranda's mother didn't observe many Jewish traditions, the one thing she refused to give up was the Sabbath meal. From time to time, they invited Nadine, who would join in with the other women in the house, lighting candles as the sun started to set. Nadine was fascinated by this family with so many aunts and uncles, cousins, and grandparents, all talking over one another, shouting and swearing, the older generation speaking to the youngsters as if they were scolding them, then smothering them in hugs and kisses. The telephone rang during dinner on a Friday, and Miranda ran to answer it, knowing it was her boyfriend. Her mother would take off her shoe and threaten to throw it at her and cut off her hand if she as much as touched the receiver. You yourself told me to forget that I'm Jewish. yet you won't let me answer the phone on a Friday," Miranda would say to her mother, who sat there, the shoe still in her hand, poised to throw it. When they finally had to say goodbye, with Jordan already waiting in the car that would take them to the ship, both girls wept. "You'll be going to college in a few years, and so will I. Well, as long as I don't get married and start popping out little Italian octopus babies," Miranda said, giggling, determined to lighten the sadness that hung over them. The two girls laughed at the idea and embraced. They separated, knowing but not wanting to acknowledge that they would never see each other again.